ahead. Okay, so let's begin. The presenters are just going to go through, just sort of the basics of what's in the curriculum unit. There'll be different opinions about that. It's okay, not every curriculum unit has to be exactly the same. We have general guidelines, but there's room for creativity. So I'm going to let the presenters go ahead and get started.
Yeah, the first section is rationale.
The narrative.
Yeah. Want to say anything about that?
So the idea of writing this is to write it so that other teachers will read it, and at the end of reading it, they should have an idea about the background of your content, how they can implement it in their classroom, and have some lesson ideas that they can take and adapt and teach from. So the idea behind it being a narrative approach is think about writing something that you would find helpful to read. If you were, say, going to create a new unit about, like mine was about music and the civil rights unit to Black Lives Matter. So if I didn't know anything about that, I wanted to create a unit that would teach me what I needed to know to get started implementing that in my classroom. And so it's very narrative in approach, but also academic. So you're writing for a college audience, not for your kids, for example.
Yeah, I agree. And a lot of the notes that you're taking in your seminars weekly will help you with that narrative. So kind of synthesizing and rewriting what you've learned every week from your professor, and now you're putting it into teacher language.
This is all just on plagiarism, more or less, right? So,
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, one of the other cool perks of this program is once you've written your curriculum, it gets published by Penn, and they're all up on the TIP website. So you want to be really sure that you don't get published writing something that's not your own work. And I think that's the main idea of this slide, but your work will be published for the general public to access.
And I will just say they're useful. Like when I was a baby teacher and the internet was like a whole new toy, I found Yale curriculum units online when I was teaching in a correctional facility in Cincinnati. And I still have a binder of about 8 units from Yale fellows that I implemented pieces of in my own classroom. So like I was printing them off like crazy because it was the golden years when we had unlimited ink and paper and toner and you didn't have to worry about any of those things. So I just kept printing these 30-page units, and I have a binder this thick of now, God, those are now 20 years old, those units. Whoever those fellows were who wrote them. But I read them and implemented them in my classroom. So the stuff that you're going to produce and publish online could be the inspiration for some baby teacher trying to figure out, how in the name of heaven to keep her children occupied for the whole class period, which is absolutely what that did for me. So, rationale is, this is the meat and potatoes. Each unit has to have all these different sections. And this is the first one that's due.
All right, so the rationale is really important because it's describing your situation as a teacher, okay? You really want to explain why you're teaching your unit, what gave you the inspiration for it, if that's present. This is a time where you can actually describe what your student population is, because people are interested in that. This program is designed to strengthen teachers in public schools who are serving students who maybe have socioeconomic disadvantages and so forth. And so it's important to make that known up front. And that way, when teachers are reading your unit, they can relate. And they can say, okay, that means if I read this person's work, I can definitely find a piece of it and actually teach it to my students who have similar experiences, similar academic experiences. Like, for example, when I write my chemistry units, I always put in my unit that I always have one chemistry class that has a split math group. And so one class will have geometry students and algebra students, all the other algebra 2 students, and all the other chemistry sections that I have are just algebra 2. And I think that's important for teachers to know, because that means one class is going to be more apt to helping each other, one class is going to be more apt to advancing through the math part of chemistry more quickly, all right? And so those are the things you want to look for when you're writing your rationale. And really it's to convince the teacher or the reader that, hey, this is a believable situation and that I can really grasp onto this material.
There's also the importance of connecting your topic to district curricular goals and making sure that in your rationale you say that we are covering these district objectives in a way that may not be outlined in the district curriculum, but I'm still meeting these same objectives and standards, just using this different content.
And this is the part that you're going to have the draft of the week of President's Day, so not this week coming up, but the following week. However, in my experience, this is also the part that you can pull the most out of the answers that you wrote for your application. Like a lot of this data, a lot of what comes into this section, you've already written. If you saved a copy of your responses to those essay questions from when you first applied to the program, I was able to take a lot of that and recraft it into my rationale. It wasn't as, this is the, I think, the least original research part, right, of the entire unit. So you've already done some of this work.
All right, so the background, for me, mine is going to be a little bit different than the sciences, let's say, because I'm writing mine from a perspective of a humanities teacher. So my curriculum unit last year was written for my U.S. history class. So my background was probably the most narrative-heavy portion of my entire unit, because that's where you're giving everything that, all the content knowledge that you would expect somebody to either kind of have a little bit of experience with or maybe even none at all. And that's the way that I try to write mine, was just that someone who's going to be reading this, most likely another teacher, may not have any experience with my topic at all, but if they read through the about a page and a half or 2 pages, that will really get them caught up, I think, or at least give them an introduction to the material that they could then further research on their own. So this year the background is about 3 to 5 pages, and it's due in the 7th week of the seminar session, so about the halfway point. But again, like Amanda said, I think a lot of what we write in our units is really sort of organic. Like we take stuff from the initial application that goes into the rationale, and then when we write the prospectus, a lot of that stuff later gets translated into the actual unit itself. So if you write a really strong background for your prospectus, then a lot of that legwork is done already for your final unit. And most of this, I think, is going to be coming from what you discuss in your seminar. A lot of the content, a lot of the structure and organization of it probably come from the topics that you discuss in your seminar, and your professor is your best resource in that instance. And I think it's really important to take good notes in your seminar, and especially to use the research that they give you, whether it's part of a reading or if you're asking them during your seminar for additional resources. Pretty much anything is fair game. And so, obviously, it should include content from your seminar as well as supplemented by your individual research. And for anybody who's writing in either English or social studies, just because that's kind of my area of expertise, I always try to follow the footnotes. So if you find something that's really interesting in a reading in class or even your own outside research, definitely use as much as you can find from the footnotes, kind of the auxiliary pieces that inform that. And I think that's really just going to give you a lot of information that's going to end up forming the basis of your background. And that's also what drives your objectives to a degree, as well as your lesson plans. All of that content, that's what you're kind of disseminating for your students, right? So the more information that you have present in your background, I think from an organizational standpoint, it's really easy to then map activities based on what you wrote. The way that I structured mine, I kind of had 4 major periods. I wrote mine in a musicology seminar last year, all about the history of jazz, and so I kind of chunked it into 4 main time periods, and that made it really easy for me to break it down into lessons and activities from there. But again, there's a lot of structure in the handbook, but then you also have a lot of freedom within that to be creative, whether it's stylistically or to what degree you want to break topics down, how much time you want to give to one piece versus another, and then all the activities that go along with it.
In my first year in the seminar, I was lucky to be in a science class, and as an elementary teacher and teaching third grade at the time, I wasn't sure how advanced we were going to get with the topic that we chose, and it was, the seminar was dealing with the Earth's changing climate, and my students wanted to talk a lot about Philadelphia and the problems we were having with water here at the time. So this is in the background where I got to incorporate a lot of those news resources that we had and the different articles that the city had come up with. I took a lot of those graphs and representations, visual representations, and added them in that section, which talked about why I was studying this and why I wanted to write a unit on this topic. And that was really helpful for me moving forward with the rest of the curriculum writing.
To add on to that, Matt was definitely correct in terms of just the idea that you can pull a lot of your ideas out of your background research if you do this correctly. Okay, this is the part where you're presenting something that's original. All right, not something that someone else has done before, or you might even take something that someone else is doing different, but then add another spin to it. And so this is where you become an authority. This is where you start to have a voice as a teacher, and you actually are taking on that role of being a teacher leader when you write this background section, because you're showing someone that you're an expert at taking information and applying it to the classroom. So for example, you always start off with what's in your seminar, and then you let the seminar topic inspire you. So for example, when I did my first unit, which is the evolving universe, my heart really grabbed on to how the elements were created in the universe. But because I teach at a school that promotes teaching in context, I said I gotta find a way to present this to my students contextually, not just some lofty idea, because half of my students, not even half, probably 1 out of 1,000 of them will go into outer space. I don't know. But then as I conducted my research, I found an article that talks about how scientists actually were inspired by stars creating the elements, and that allowed them to replicate that process, and therefore now we have Penn Medicine and Penn Radiology. They literally take those things in space and replicate them so that we can now treat and detect diseases. That's something that I know most teachers may not be able to do and would like to do in their classroom, especially because I'm actually a biomedical engineer prior to becoming a teacher. So I'm combining my experience with the background, and then also tugging on the students, because as was previously stated, students have questions. So students wanting to know where the elements come from, that stems from them. That wasn't my idea, but I was able to deliver it to them in a way that they can appreciate it. And writing the background might take some time, especially if you're not used to storytelling. Okay, I'm originally a scientist, and when I first wrote my background, it was very much like reading an encyclopedia. And then as I got to my second unit and my third unit at Yale, that's when I really started to get the grasp of, okay, I'm telling a story now, I'm telling a narrative, and it makes more sense to me now because we live in a social media age and people are more interested in stories that have facts in them rather than just straight facts.
That's also the part where you really go down the rabbit hole of research. If you are, like me, inclined to keep clicking on every next link because it looks like it might also be a neat story. Let me just say, start now. My professor in my seminar last year had to rein me back in because I had 40 books checked out from the Penn Library and a stack of 87 articles. And he's like, dude, it's a 30-page unit. You're going to dial that back about 15 times. But it was but this is so interesting, and that's so interesting. And, we all got into teaching because we like to learn theoretically, right? So I'm but I really want to look at, it's how is that connected? It's not connected, but it's interesting. So if you sort of start that process now, it'll be easier to prune later. I'm just warning you from my own experience. The rabbit hole is long and deep, and the Penn Library system is rich and full of books. So full of books.
And so is the temple.
So the objectives and strategies, objectives, the word we all love. And like it says on here, it's really supposed to be the blueprint for how you're gonna implement your unit in your classroom, as objectives are always supposed to be. So this section can be bulleted and have objectives as you'd have them in your classroom on the board, but in the format of students will be able to blank in order to blank. That's fine. If you're doing a science-based curriculum, there are different standards and objectives within science, so you're really gonna have to adhere to what your school wants you to use, since you'll be using this in your school. I know last year I used, I don't remember what it was like a different science curriculum, and it really didn't apply to what I was doing, so I had to change that a little bit. So you wanna pay attention to exactly what objectives that you're using.
Yeah, and the students will be able to, in order to format, can be used in the same, in a similar way that we use it in our classroom, where we say, like, students will be able to perform calculations to find basic theoretical probability in order to meet a certain district standard or curricular goal. So not in order to like be able to complete their homework or whatever you might normally put on your lesson plans, but however you would be able to tie that objective to the standards and curricular goals that you have to meet as an obligation to the district.
And your strategy section is really your scaffolding of these concepts. So if there's writing involved, if there's exploration involved, if there's research involved, how are you doing this? How are you achieving this as a teacher, and how are your students achieving your goals, your objectives within those standards?
Yeah, it can, your strategies can look like, we used group work, we discussed, we debated, we made posters and had a carousel, we played this review game, we use this strategy every day to reinforce these skills. So whatever strategies you use in your classroom to get kids really understanding the content should be included in this section as well.
And this is really the pulse on your students too. So you know what they like to do, use that to help you write this section. What is it that engages them in the classroom regularly when you're discussing whatever the topic is that you'll be writing about? Use those to guide your strategy section.
I think the objectives and strategy section can really include more than just some of the standards, but for example, I teach at an IB school and they have this concept called the approaches to learning. And so this is where I can say, okay, this is a skill that I want to develop in my students. It's not necessarily a district objective, it's not necessarily a science objective, but it might be the skill of communication, and then the activity would be like group work or collaboration, things like that. So you can actually start to mention some of the skill sets that are actually important, not just for test taking, but just being a lifelong learner in general.
Yeah, a lot. From the elementary perspective too, a lot. I think there are a couple elementary teachers in here. Those are actually outlined in the Philadelphia, the school district standards too. The life skills, communication skills. So elementary is a little different than high school that way. If you are high school, I think that's a great way to put it in there.
Yeah.
And your activities are the things you'll be doing. So this is the fun part. So we've talked about what you want to achieve, how you achieved it as a teacher, how you learned, and what you want your students to learn. Now, how are you going to do that in your classroom? And there's a million different ways you could approach this. So you want to be creative with this. As teachers, we often say don't recreate the wheel. If you do find something in your research online, maybe a lesson plan, use that, tailor that to your classroom, to your teaching, and to your teaching style. I know I've done that in the past with my units. I've found a lot of activities that pertain to my topic, but they weren't exactly how I would teach them. So take that, change it to cater to your class, to you as a teacher, and to what you're interested in.
Yeah. My unit last year was, is there life beyond our own? And I used a lot of lesson plans from NASA that were a little bit like, here's this major physics concept, just like throw it at your students and they'll get it. So I had to add a lot to those, but like Jamie said, we were able to like take the stuff that already exists and make it your own. Like, how would you be able to use it in your classroom? And your lesson plans don't have to be in any specific format. Whatever format that you use that you're most comfortable with is acceptable, as long as it will also be accessible to whatever teacher might download and read your unit.
Yeah. This is the awesome part about the way these units are written. You've done the backward planning from the start. You started with the rationales in the background. So you've done that backward planning, and this is the bulk of it. This is the lesson plan. You've kind of written in a long way what you're trying to achieve, so now have fun with it.
And I think for the activities as well, this is another portion of your unit that's really easy to be synthesized with stuff that you learn in your seminar. So from prior experience last year, I really never knew how to, I think, efficaciously critique a piece of music in the classroom beyond just listening to it and maybe breaking down the lyrics. But within the first probably 2 seminars, we learned some key vocab terms that actually allowed us to listen to a piece of music and kind of analyze it and break it down. And then throughout the rest of the seminar, we looked at kind of like socio-political, socio-economic elements that may have either influenced or been influenced by the music. And that was absolutely present in my unit that I wrote. And so I think that even just as like a baseline of activities, some things that you may either do at the beginning of the unit or even pepper in kind of throughout, it's a really good opportunity to pull that stuff out of your seminar. And this year in History of Hollywood, I've already learned a couple key vocab terms and a couple ways to really critically analyze film. And this is stuff that's going to appear in my unit again this year. So I think that, again, I can't state enough how much or I guess how important the role of your professor and some of the activities that you even do in your seminar. I mean, don't be afraid to mimic a lot of what you do and what you see in your seminar, because these are Penn and Temple professors that are experts in their field, and they've done this for years. They've disseminated this information for most of their career. So I think that there's definitely value in what we pick up.
I was going to make that point as well. That's a great point, that if you do enjoy a lesson that you've done in your seminar, how can you recreate that in your classroom? And using kind of the same model that your professor has done, but for your students and for that age range.
Yeah, sometimes you get lucky and you can even implement something early. Like Matt and I were in the same seminar last year, and Dr. Ramsey brought this thing in just out of the headlines, and it changed my whole lesson plan with my actual kids in that moment for that week. And then I was able to recreate it in my unit plan and say, okay, now to make it fit this objective, I'm going to reshape it this way. But I'd already actually tried it with real life kids with their real life issues, so I kind of knew how to, the first time you put something in and it's like, oh, that would have been better if I had done this, this, and this. And the next time you're like, oh, I'm a teaching rock star. So I was like, okay, well now I can just move straight to the rock star writing in my unit because I've already made all my mistakes with my real life kids the first go around. So that can be kind of fun as well if there's, something pops up and you're like, oh, let me just try this right now before I have to write it up. It makes you feel a little more confident in that section.
I'm going to focus on the timeline of the classroom activities. It's pretty common that if you write a unit, you're basically, writing from point A to point Z. And, in my experience here at TIP, your unit does not always have to be written that way. I think, for example, my second unit, What is the Earth Made Of? The seminar was What is the Earth Made Of? My unit was entitled Extractions of the Earth. It actually consisted of classroom activities that I could not fit into one classic unit. So instead, even though the unit focuses on what is the earth made of, that's the theme that I'm harping on, I'm actually touching concepts from different traditional curriculum units or topics that are on the district website. So for example, I'm going to have my students actually synthesize a mineral in class. But in order to understand minerals, they have to understand ionic compounds and covalent compounds, which are actually listed as 2 totally different units. And then I can even take them on the journey of discovering elements in the earth and learning those elements and how they're positioned and patterned on the periodic table, which is again another classic unit that's separate. So really, my second unit really spanned across different topics, but it tied them all together in a non-traditional way.
You have to have at least 2, but you're gonna find yourself wanting to include more on that end.
Right, I would, yeah, completely agree with that. And I think also, one thing you can do is you can, obviously all of your activities are gonna be part of your unit, so everything is gonna have kind of a flow to it. But you can write your unit in such a way that you could even pull out specific sections of it and maybe implement it as part of another unit at another time if you wanted to. So it's really, the more interchangeable you make these activities, I think the more application they'll have throughout your entire course for that year, not just as one isolated unit. Because I also try to think about it as far as other teachers reading the units, maybe they don't want to use the entire thing, but they want to take out certain parts and adapt it and modify it, and I tried to, as much as I could, build that in a little bit as well.
Yeah, my school, I was in the seminar last year that was the contemplative practices of the world's religions, and it was very based in studying religion, and I pulled that out and did a whole unit on mindfulness in the classroom, but then kind of modified it after the seminar to be in school suspension room, nixing the suspension term and changing it to the mindfulness space. This year, my school is trying that coming up this week, and they're using a lot of the activities that I found tweaked for our school to move forward with this room, this space that we're going to try and use in our elementary school. So the appendices are the kind of the tangibles that you're taking in your classroom activities and putting them into a work that someone else could look at and use. So note cards, worksheets, whatever it is.
PowerPoints,
PowerPoints,
yeah.
And also your resources, where did you get the information, so if they want to read more, and if there's anything that they can give their kids to read, like an article about something that supplements your work, then provide the link and the author and whatever for that article, so if the teacher wants to print it and provide it as a handout for kids for their own background, that's an option for them.
I just want to add something about the appendices, and you may have gotten this earlier on, but it is important to cite sources. You may mention things in your background section, evidence or literature that you have read that backs up what you're writing about, and those things should be cited in the appendices following the citation style that you're using, whether it's APA style for sciences and social sciences, or MLA style or Chicago style for literature and humanities. So, and there are online resources that you can go to figure out those different citation styles. The Purdue OWL is one place you can go online to figure all that out.
This is something you might want to do in the beginning. I think we actually do have to in the beginning, right? The unit summary, yeah. It's
Yeah,
from
but-
your prospectus, right?
Yeah, I ended up changing mine, so
Oh, okay.
I think if your original plan changes from your application, then your abstract may change, but the abstract is what goes on the TIP website with your curriculum unit, just to like give a brief description of what is, what's in your unit and what teachers might find it useful, what subject areas it would cover, what it would apply to.
It's helpful to go onto the TIP website and look at the abstracts that people have already written for their different units to get a sense of how you want to write your abstract.
I think that's great advice just in general, to go online to the TIP website and look at past units, especially units that have been written by people teaching the grade or content that you're currently teaching. I did a lot of digging to see what other high school English teachers had come up with in different seminars that had no relationship to mine. I mean, I had a music seminar, but I was reading like poetry seminars and literary, like all kinds of other stuff, just to kind of see what other people had done, to give me a sense of the work that I needed to be sort of brainstorming about and conceptualizing for my own stuff.
Yeah, for the abstract, you pretty much just want to really attract the reader. I mean, I learned on YouTube that if you don't get your pitch out in the first 8 seconds, then you ought as well just lost the viewer already, because attention spans are really short. And so if they're looking for units online, your readers, you want to just really throw in some information that will really catch them and make them want to click that button to download.
That's it. That's all the show.
That's it, so,
Question?
yeah,
So-
this is the questions.
One thing that I want to suggest before you go to questions, could you show a few examples of units that you have written? Could we maybe explore online a little bit and download a couple of them?
So,
Anybody want to? I can man the computer over here.
I'm not sure how to do it from that. It's a fun toy, but I don't know how to do what you're asking from that situation.
So, anybody want to volunteer and be the guinea pig?
You can use mine if you want.
Okay, from the contemplative practices?
Sure.
Okay,
You can.
all right, let's see if I can.
Actually, that's a good one.
All right. All right, now I just need to switch the monitors here.
Anyone have any questions while this is being set up?
Yeah, I have a question. I just want to ask if you can kind of just explain a little bit more of how when you took your unit and realized you were covering like an array of different content standards, did you have lessons for all those content standards, or did you kind of narrow it down but include the content standards that it could cover? So in case the teacher, could you explain a little bit more about how to do that?
I think you could do just what you said, that you could include a couple of your lessons, and it's your unit and your narrative. So you could include a part in the beginning that you aren't able to cover all of the lessons, or that you're not going to, but these are some of the things you could do.
I know what I've done is I'll present the timeline of the lessons, and then I'll point out which lessons I think most teachers have a handle on, and then those are the ones I don't elaborate on. I'll say, okay, this is where you teach your students about protons, neutrons, and electrons, and you do that in your own style. But then here's how you can take that lesson to the next level with my lesson that I'm adding with isotopes and medicinal chemistry and treating diseases. So, I won't necessarily tell another chemistry teacher how to teach the basics, but I want to give them the extra, the thing that they're really looking for.
Yeah, I have 16 standards in my appendix for my unit that I think I would cover implementing this unit. But if you picked up my unit and were going to implement it, you would find 3 lessons that cover about 5 of those standards, and you could address those other 16 in the, like I included a beginning of the unit lesson, a middle of the unit lesson, and a summative culminating activity lesson. So there were things in those, but as you implemented this, you would decide which of those 16 you wanted to cover or not. You might pick my unit up and say, you know what, I don't know what standards you thought, I'm gonna use these 10, and that's the way I'm gonna approach this, and that would be fine.
I'm a little confused with the rationale and the problem statement. I mean, how do we just get started? For the very first paper that's due, the very first part that's due. Is that our rationale? Is like, you know, we're just asking ourselves, why do we want to do this?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
So-
that's, at its simplest form, that's it, I think.
Okay,
It's why
so-
do you want to research this, why do you think it's important to teach about? And I think this is a really critical area of the unit where you can refer to other people's units, because everyone's rationale is different. Some people write a unit because they think that it's part of history, or there's some literature that kind of is under the radar that more people should know about, their students should know about. Like, for example, I wrote mine for my students because I thought it was something that they would really find interest in, and they would help them to research more of their own history. So it really depends on the individual.
Well, how much of that is from within the individual that's writing it and researching? I mean, am I gonna be trying to research that part to develop my very first part?
I think that first part is really coming from, when you think about why you did the application for the fellowship, why am I on this website right now filling this out? Why am I answering these questions? Why am I interested in doing this? I think that's a lot of where my thoughts come from in this
Yeah.
beginning.
Yeah.
One thing I just want to add, we've changed things a little bit in the past. Some people wrote a problem statement that was separate from the rationale and used the rationale as what we're now calling the background. That's where they would put the information that they learned in the seminar. So now we're saying that the rationale is your problem statement. That's where you justify the curriculum unit. And the background is the main place to put the things that you've learned, the new information that you're bringing to the unit.
Yeah, logistically, this format is not what we're doing.
Right, this is a little bit different, but it has the content in it that you need.
Can I ask, I don't know whether this helps them or not, but based on this year's format, the rationale the background kind of flows out of your rationale. Because if you talk about why you're doing it and who your students are and why the seminar is great for your students, then you tell them about the seminar. And the
Yes.
two get linked, and that might help you to get started, you know, to write.
Yeah. I actually did have a little bit of research in my rationale, just like, so mine was about life beyond our own and the universe, and the doomsday clock moved in the middle of our seminar. So like in my rationale, I cited that. I cited the most recent scientific research saying that our planet was that much closer to expiration. So, and that was why I thought that this topic was so important to cover with my students. So you could include stuff like that.
Jamie, was there any particular section that you wanted to kind of show off here?
I think the problem statement rationale, since it's broken up in a different way, this is what we're kind of talking about. I began with why I wanted to teach, why I wanted to study this topic, and why I thought it was important, because the connection between what we were studying in our seminar, being religion, and this idea of a mindful suspension room or reflection room, which we're calling it at my school. There's a lot that you need to bridge in those two topics. So when I was applying for this specific seminar, having come from the year before doing a science-based seminar, I wanted to, and this unit was also for a school, it wasn't for just my class, it was, something I wanted to present to my principal and say, hey, I studied this, this is a really good idea. So I was doing a lot of work, so I wanted to explain that in a way that made sense to anybody who was gonna read it. So that's what I started with, the problem statement and the rationale, where it came from, and then I did do a little bit of research for my rationale to explain that this has worked, this idea of a reflection room has worked in the past. I think I included it in and I included the suspension rates for the school district in the beginning, some data to support my reasoning for why I was studying this and why I was taking the information from my seminar and synthesizing and integrating it in a different way. So I think that's the most research I did, was just to include some statistical data supporting my opinions.
Right, and so you can see that here in the rationale, and you see that she's used APA style for the citations, the author year citations. Anybody else want to show off a unit that they wrote that's maybe a little bit different?
I'll go, yeah. My most recent one.
Okay. Try
Edward, can you just show one more thing? I actually did something wrong on this, so I think it would be kind of good to highlight that. Can you
Okay.
go down to the standards?
Yeah.
And I touched on this briefly in the beginning.
Just had to find what the mouse is because, here we go. Check
This down.
at the very end.
Yeah, at the very end, those.
Yeah.
So those are not standards that are, these are standards I found in the units that I was using, and I wasn't really sure at the time how to include these, or not include, but how to change them into the standards that we use as a district. So if you know, that's not a format that I'm familiar with, this MMSD, I don't even really know what that is, but it's wrong. So I got an email this summer saying, no, can you explain why you use these, and could you change them into district format? So I had to do that, but there's something not to do.
So one of the things that we're going to do in this seminar session that I hope will help is when you go to list your standards, when we publish your unit online, and when you do that last section where you're asked to create an abstract, keywords and standards, we're going to create an online form where you select the standards from a list instead of writing them up all by yourself. You should, of course, refer to them in the text of your unit, but in this part, you can select them from the list, and that way they'll be searchable. Everybody will have the same ones. Yeah.
I think what else is helpful, I know that the district on their website, they will give you, for example, in math, they'll give you this, the state, they'll also give you the national.
Yeah.
And if people are looking at this from around the country, they actually need both, I think.
Right, and we plan on giving you different kinds of standards that you can choose. So district, state, core curriculum. Yeah. Did you want to add something else, Jamie?
No, that's a really good point. I know the year before when I did the science-based curriculum, that I had included both the Pennsylvania State Common Core standards and the national standards, and that's really good for people, like you said, who are looking from other places, say, how can I implement this in my classroom, and what standard does this fall under for my state?
All right, let's have a look at Buell's unit. I'm just going to try to give it a here you can see we put the abstract up front here. We're going to be launching a new website soon, which will be a little bit different, but the abstract will still be up front, and then you'll be able to get to the unit like this.
So I think you should go down to the classroom activities.
Okay. Another thing that we'll do in the new website is you'll be able to click to get to a certain section and be linked. Quite a lot of good information in here that Yule has included. Here?
Yeah, so like this first project is really just kind of giving my students an opportunity to kind of explore the endangered elements. So this is my example of trying to show you that the lessons are really the ones you want to give away, and not just something that's just repeatedly done already. You can scroll down some. So like, you know, I provide them with a list, websites to go to, and criteria. I think that's also important. You know, I think in the past somebody might have mentioned that sometimes the units have been written without some type of evaluation. You know, you definitely want to tell the reader and the students, you know, what they're going to be evaluated on, what they really need to know. So I post those questions that are used to assess their work. And so this is actually a rubric, yeah, that I used. And this is from my experiences working with really with IB, which has taught me the friendliness of using rubrics. It's just made grading easier. So I won't necessarily, I'll give one rubric in the actual body, and then if I make others, I'll just put those in the appendix. Yeah. And you can keep going. But that's all for like the same activity. All right. You can keep going.
And again, you can see the level of detailed information that he's included here, which will really create a blueprint for delivering this lesson or these lessons.
Yeah, let's next one. I'm gonna go to mine. So this is the one I'm actually gonna have my students do hopefully in like 2 weeks, where they're actually creating their own minerals. So like, I really had to include a lot of detail from like all my lesson plans didn't actually have the detail like preparation time and this. But when you're doing an experiment, it really requires a lot of detail that we kind of take for granted. So you can scroll down some, because I really want to get to like the pictures.
Oh, sure. Yep.
So
Here we go.
So, you know, this is actually an experiment that I found out that people started doing within like the past 5 years, 5 to 10 years. So because, you know, universities are very secretive, you know, they don't really show or demonstrate what they're really doing. So like, I feel like my job as a teacher is to make that translatable, knowing the ins and outs of being in a laboratory and then making that translatable to other teachers, because it's one thing to see it written scientifically, but then to go and do it yourself, it's a whole nother ball game. And so to be able to like scale it down, make sure you have the appropriate numbers of supplies distributed and so forth. So like, this is really helpful things that you won't see in a science journal. But I had to go in and flesh that out myself. And then even, this was like a big deal to me because I think this last one was actually recently discovered like in 2016. And so like to be able to take that and to replicate that and give that as a useful skill set to my students, I think that was important.
A lot of great color pictures in here too. Makes it visual.
No question. So, looking here at these lessons, are they under one particular standard, but they branch off to teach that standard in different lessons? or are you covering several standards with this lesson?
So I'm definitely covering several
Yes.
at this point. So this is actually a culminating activity where I would assess students in their ability to not just follow procedures, but to also reflect on the impacts that, so these are all minerals that can possibly be used to decontaminate water. All right, so by then they've already learned ionic compounds, why, what makes them great at attracting certain things in the water and so forth. And so now they're really just kind of picking and choosing based on aesthetics and also hypothesizing what will work. And then we'll go from there. So it's bigger than just teaching the chemistry concepts. Now I'm even branching into environmental,
Real world
and
application.
really developing a skill set.
So what is the timeline of this unit?
So just understanding the basics to get to this point really started in like beginning of November.
No, I don't mean your
but-
timeline of writing it. I mean your timeline of implementing it in the classroom.
Yeah,
From
so
what
this
point
is
to?
this is my unit where, say, that first lesson was taught. The first lesson I showed you about endangered species, endangered elements, that's taught in November. But then the second activity is taught maybe a month later, and this one has to be taught after covalent compounds, which is coming up soon because it contains all those. It contains metal. It looks like powder, but it contains metal, and then it contains non-metal materials. And I still have to talk to them about how these things arrange themselves in space to make these nice crystals.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick note, it's just amazing, I love how you integrated also the social, or should I say cultural context. I saw King Solomon.
Yeah.
And all that is the great part, I remember from even just doing this once before, we're allowed to do that, to bring in that richness, the difference between our stuff and their stuff,
Yes.
as far as like just doing a standardized type of thing, is we can bring that into the context. If when you teach Mancala as a game, you're also teaching the cultural, you're hitting your students, you know who your students are, and then all that ties into background as well. So it's intracurricular. The English teacher is thanking you, the social studies teacher is saying thank you. It's almost collaborative.
Even
and
our
it-
teacher.
And it's a
Yeah.
reflection of them, because students from different cultures, and just even preparing them for careers. You're addressing some career standards there, because we are looking for ways nowadays in careers, using chemistry to empower ourselves, better water conditions. They can go overseas and maybe get a job, help them develop, it just could go on and on.
Right.
I'm looking at that as a life skill, I can do that, I can help my kids.
Yes.
I'd like to know how you handle the actual application list, preparing students to actually do the experiment in the lab, the safety concern, the actual following directions. I often find that when I'm trying to do a lab, no matter how much preparation, even seeing it done on the video, etc., that I wound up having to individually help every single student carry out the lab physically, or going to them and assisting them. And it takes if I have that chemistry class for an entire year, it takes almost a half of that year to get them to be able to function independently, or never independently really, but to follow laboratory procedures and directions that where I'm not nervous.
Got you. Really what's worked for me with the 10th graders is just modeling it and modeling it as they read the instructions. Because I know they're not going to read the instructions. I'm a third-year teacher, so I've been in a position where I thought I could just let them independently do stuff, and it's completely fallen apart. And so when I actually do the experiment right there in front of their faces, either the same day or the day before, then it sticks with them a little bit better, and then they can see, okay, he's serious when he says this stuff smells really bad and you can irritate your nose and your eyes, or that beaker is really, really hot, so you want to be careful about how you handle it. So I think when they see it up front, rather than just give them a safety lesson and then they forget all about safety, it really changes how they do that. And they have a lot more fun. And you know, it's not with this unit, but even with my Yale unit, when I wrote the unit, I made an intent for the students to record themselves doing it. So now they can't look like a fool, you know, doing the lab procedure. They actually have to show me that they are doing it carefully and intentionally, paying attention to detail.
Challenge me if you disagree with this, but I think in writing the unit, you're also assuming the most ideal conditions. That you're writing it from the perspective of, like, if I really, really wanted to achieve this, what am I doing? How am I doing it? And it also gives you a guide for how you would do it in your classroom when you get to do this. If you're not doing these lessons and these labs and whatever it is that you're doing as you're writing, then for the following year, you know, you're thinking about what would I need to do first? What are the scaffolds that I need to provide for my students? And what might not work, how do I avoid that? Those are things you can also include in there.
Yeah.
And it is a unit of, you know, lessons, and you can put that in your background. You're not necessarily putting every single thing that is going to be perfect or that you might achieve, but you're trying to think of it in terms of, if I'm to carry this out in completion, what's it going to look like?
Yeah, that's great right there. Yeah.
I just want to add one more thing to this. This is really empowering. If you think about what the district is giving you to teach, if you think about all the things that are being omitted from district, state, national standards. I was just reading, I think in Iowa, they have completely stripped any mention of climate change from the state standards. I put a post on our social media about that. So this is an opportunity to inject into the curriculum what you think is important and what you think the students want to know, or the students need to know. And in order to do that, you've got to be really deliberate and really thoughtful about it.
Yeah, you never know who's looking at it, who else is pulling this and saying, oh, this is really awesome, I'd want to try this in my school, and it's not something that anyone would normally do.
You want to maybe take a look at one of the music units, that might be a little bit different. Amanda, you did one, Matthew, you did one too. Which? Okay, well, Amanda, we'll take a look at yours and then we'll see in time. Do you want to say anything about it, Amanda?
So sometimes what happens when you write your application is that, and then you get into the seminar, your entire idea changes from what you thought you were going to do in your application narratives. In my case, that was not true this time. It may entirely be true for this philosophy seminar I'm in now. However, in this particular case, I knew that I wanted to look at some kind of connection from civil rights protest music to contemporary Black Lives Matter and the music that's being pulled in and used within that movement, and how that might be the same or different, and how it might either empower or alienate people who had been affiliated with the original civil rights movement. I was thinking there might be challenges going from, Fannie Lou Hamer and Bernice Johnson Reagan to Kendrick Lamar and Beyonce, and I wanted to look at that. And so that's kind of where we started and where we ended up. I was also teaching the first of John Lewis's trilogies of graphic novels, March, to 10th grade students at Kensington while I was developing this. And so those kids and that history that we were talking about was very much at the forefront of my head. So when I sat down to write, what I realized was I had done a whole lot of research up to, say, 1975, and then I realized I was really shortchanging contemporary stuff, and I had to go back down the rabbit hole and find some more information. And also had to get really comfortable, and Dr. Ramsey helped with that, because I wanted to connect it to something that's like literally developing right this minute, there isn't a lot of scholarly peer-reviewed journals about music in Black Lives Matter because it's happening this very second. And so I had to get comfortable with looking at other sort of less in the academy sources, and he referred me to some well-respected blogs and to some sort of culture critics who were more influential and instrumental in sort of shaping that modern narrative. So that ended up being a big part. I had to sort of dig into other spots that I hadn't thought about. But again, like I think Matt was saying earlier, your professor as a resource is crucial. I was constantly emailing or calling him and saying, I don't know how to find Kenya, and he would send me, 87 resources, and then I was reading for 30 hours. So yeah, my background section is so much longer than is necessary. If you were to, 10 pages of my unit is typed single-spaced background. That is not what is required by this thing. But I refer you again to the library system and the rabbit hole. I'm an English teacher and I like to read. It's a problem in my life, and in this unit.
It's not required, but there's nothing that says you can't do it. If you love this stuff and you want to spend time and you can write a lot of good material, that's fine. Some people out there will appreciate it. One thing I want to mention about this is, Amanda, you made use of subsections and subheadings, and in the unit template that I distributed to everybody, you have some built-in headings and subheadings that you should make use of. The one cool thing about those is if you're using Microsoft Word to write a document and you use those headings and subheadings, they'll appear in the navigation pane on the left-hand side. And so as you're working on your document, you can quickly navigate to a different section using those. So it's a good way of organizing your work. Yeah.
Just one thing about the rabbit hole. My backgrounds can be 25 pages long because once you start researching, you really fall in love with what you're learning about. And so what I've done in the past years is I keep all that somewhere else. Then I extract from that for this unit. But then as I go back, I say, like listening to you, I say, oh yeah, minerals, solid solutions, I gotta go back and see that. It's not in my unit, but I have it somewhere in my document where I did and I can continue to research and say, oh, I wanna keep learning about that because it's not just the unit. You don't learn it for the unit and stop. It still stays in your mind, and so if you keep all those rabbit hole queries somewhere safe, you can go back to it and say, oh yeah, that was really cool, let me go back and read that. So don't just, 3 to 5 or 5 to 7 for this assignment, but you're gonna get 20 or 30 pages of stuff. And I suggest keep it somewhere, organized well, you can get to it quickly and say that stuff is really a treasure for me that I didn't use in the unit. So just to know that.
Matthew, why don't we take a look at yours?
Sure.
To get a different view of music. Hold on a second. There's my mouse.
So-
Anything you want to?
So I had, I think, some of the same, I guess you could say, maybe issues that Amanda did, but I guess it's a good problem to have. The original scale and breadth of my unit was going to be way too extensive, something that you could probably write like an entire textbook about. And Dr. Ramsey had to kind of stop me and say, all right, you gotta reel this in a little bit, maybe focus on, because I was looking at basically like the development of Afro-Cuban music over a period of like 100+ years and trying to tie it into my students, and then there was going to be like a culminating project where they used everything we learned and they tied it into like a modern musician and where, tracing really like the elements, which sounds really cool, but I would probably need an entire school year to cover that, not a 2-week unit. And so my prospectus ended up being entirely different from what my end final unit was, which is totally fine, but it forced me to really kind of look at it more critically and say, what are the major topics, major time periods, especially that I want to look at, and what do I kind of want to juxtapose it with as far as like traditional history? Because like we were talking about earlier with content standards and things like that, and like what Yul said about us being the experts and trying to create something new and really creative, I think the difficulty sometimes is finding a way to map out things that aren't already in the content standards, but then also making them fit. And the way that I did that was by looking at like early roots of jazz music and then tying that in with a period in history. Like the early history went along really well with like 18th, 19th, 20th century, and then we tie that in to what's actually happening in U.S. history at that time. So there's kind of that give and take between the two. And that was something that was a little bit of a challenge for me, just trying to fit it into the curriculum in a way that was meaningful and not just like, well, I think this is really interesting, so I'm going to try to map a bunch of stuff to it to justify it. I actually wanted it to be congruent and show that there is an actual, there's a legitimate reason to discuss this kind of information in class.
So, and this has got a great succinct history of jazz. You know, anybody's interested, this is a good place to learn about jazz.
And now all my family members buy me jazz books for like every holiday or gift giving occasion. I just got a 500-page book for Christmas for my house.
Just want to point out too that Matthew has used the MLA style for citation, so you have author page number instead of author year, like in the APA.
And so the vocab terms right there, that was like day one stuff that we went over, and it was something that shaped pretty much every discussion in class. I mean, even at the initial meeting last year when we met all the professors, after we'd all enrolled in the seminars, I just remember Dr. Ramsey coming up, I think he might have been one of the last people to speak, with his computer. He said, I want to play a piece of music for you guys. And he played it into the microphone, and it was like very tinny, and but I mean, everybody started really talking about it just in that session, and that was sort of the shape of what every seminar meeting was like after that. And so this was stuff that is present throughout my entire unit, because these are the key terms that you really need to know in order to do any of the activities that precede everything else that I write in the beginning of it. And so, again, I can't state this enough, like the things that we do in our seminars should absolutely shape and be present in your curriculum units, because it's really meaningful, but it also gives you an early framework to move on from. Like, you know the basics through your seminar, and then you make it your own with your own independent research and how you shape the activities. Oh, and also in the objectives, I think I either mentioned it in the objectives or back up in the rationale, but in any case, I made it clear in the beginning of my unit that you could teach this as either a standalone unit, and it could be adapted very easily for an English class or for a history class, but also teachers should feel free, and I encourage them to take out portions, like if they just want to focus on one lesson or one time period. If you want to look at bebop, for example, and you know, sort of the cultural elements that contributed to a particular period in history, I encourage people to do that as well. So, I mean, they're all kind of universal in that they could either be taken as one solid piece, and you can teach the whole unit start to finish, you can pull out parts of it, you can kind of match them up, sort of like puzzle pieces. I mean, really can be used very fluidly.
Any other questions on Matt's unit? Bridget, let's take a look at your unit too, which will be a little bit different.
I'd like to ask Matt a question.
Oh, sure.
So Matt, actually, in the classroom with your students, you'll give them vocabulary, and then do they define it from, you know, like looking it up on the computer or looking in text, or do you talk about what the meanings are with them?
So there's a number of different exercises you could do for that. I mean, just because that serves as sort of the framework of analysis for whenever we listen to a piece of music in this unit, I would give them the definitions and have them record them. But then from there, they can also kind of put their own spin on it. If you have them do like a Freyer model, or if they want to even just draw like a single image for it, act it out. So there's a lot of different opportunities there, but I would say for a baseline, I give them the definition first and have them record it so they know that this is going to be the tool for analysis, and then they can put it in their own terms, whether it's through like a mnemonic device or again like a Freyer model, image analysis or image association. So there's a number of ways you could do it. There's something else I was going to say, but if I think of it all. Does that answer your question?
little bit, another question is like, so you play a piece of music and what are you gonna do? You're gonna say to the student, what do you think about this, or how does this make you feel, or write me a short story about what comes to your mind when you listen to this piece? What's your real approach to this?
So it can be general, I think, early on, because until you really start to build the context, a lot of the early parts of the unit are just kind of like the history of the music itself. Like we start off with a lot of traditional African music, like West African drumming and things like that, just to build kind of like background knowledge that you need and look at different types of influences on jazz, like call and response and syncopation, and a lot of key elements of the music. So it could be very general like that in the beginning, like, oh, what do you think of this? How does it make you feel? But then as we move forward with it, the whole unit itself is really reflective. Like it's, what are you taking from this? But then also looking at it in context. So like what was going on at that period, at that time in history, and is it reflected in the music? If so, how? And then, I teach at a creative and performing arts high school, so anytime we are doing things with this type of music, I like to try to exemplify it through the activities as well. So like when we look at West African drumming, we're going to have like boxes or empty trash cans or things like that, and we're actually going to be playing out the patterns. And that even by itself, I think, just serves as a good hook. It doesn't have to be necessarily a central activity, but it's really hands-on and it builds interest because you're not just now listening to it, but you're creating the music yourself.
Thank you.
Great, okay. Okay, probability and the observable universe. We're getting into the math world. Bridget, anything you
Yeah.
want to say about this?
Well, last year was my first seminar, and I didn't really know how I was going to connect my seminar topic to my Algebra 1 class, because the math that we were doing, the little bit of math that we were doing in my seminar class was like well over my head. I had to like ask the professor for like to go over each of the steps like one by one again and again before I was like, oh, I think I get it. And then trying to figure out how to translate that into something that my ninth graders would understand was like a real task. So I spent a lot of my unit trying to get my students thinking about, like trying to figure out how to get my students thinking about the enormity of our universe, and asking questions about like, well, does this make sense? What can we know? Like what information would we need? And asking like those bigger questions at the very beginning of the unit, and then going into like really basic probability, because most of my ninth graders didn't know anything about probability, or at least not very much, and then working our way back to that really big question about like, is it possible that there's life beyond our own in the universe, and trying to tie in their experience with basic probability and scientific notation to answer that big question. I had a really hard time with it, but I did do a lot with my students last year, just like little mini lessons that really helped me gauge like, okay, this is not something that we're gonna get in a class period or even a week of class periods. I'm gonna like abandon that idea a little bit and try to focus on like smaller, more compact, more easily digestible stuff, and then try to get kids just thinking about that really big idea of, is there other life in the universe? Like what information would we need? How could we verify that it's true or not? Like what do we know about math that we can use to kind of answer that question?
And Bridget, can you tell us at what point do probability and scientific notation come up in district standards? Like what grade level and to what extent?
So probability is like every year from I think third grade on, but it's always like a very little unit at the end of the year when everybody's trying to prepare for PSSAs and Keystones. So I have found in the past that I spend a lot less time on probability, and it's usually like the kind of scrunched unit at the very end of the year, right before report cards go in. And it's a really important topic that I don't think students have enough exposure to. So I did try to include that more. Scientific notation, I believe, is 6th or 7th grade. I don't know if there's any middle school math teachers that can verify that.
It's fifth.
Fifth?
Yeah.
But I've seen it all the way through 8th too.
Yeah.
Yeah, if they do like 5th and 8th, it kind of skips 6th and 7th.
Yeah, it's kind of
When we
weird.
get
Yeah.
to 9th grade, like, if they haven't seen scientific notation since 5th grade or since 8th grade, it's kind of like starting from scratch. So, yeah. They have a little bit of background in both of those things, and the real challenge was kind of combining like really, really big and really, really small numbers for like scientific notation and the ideas that we covered when talking about probability, and kind of challenging students to use both of those skill sets in conjunction.
Anything else you want to sort of show off about this unit?
I guess.
Any of the lesson plans or anything?
So my like assessment, and the professor for my seminar, Ms. Howe, was very, very flexible with me. I was like, I'm really not sure how I'm gonna get this like very high level topic down to something that might like boil down to something that my 14-year-old 9th graders are going to really understand. And he's like, just like you can talk about this idea without doing all the really nitty-gritty math, and you can just incorporate parts of like this really big topic into your assessments. And I found an assessment on another, like on a math teacher's blog that I really liked, and it was just students creating a probability game, or a game that would where players would utilize probability to win. And my final assessment was just a slight adaptation of that, where they had to include something about the possibility, the probability of life beyond our own in the universe, where something in the game had to do with like interplanetary exploration, with any sort of calculations about planets that would involve using scientific notation or any probability calculations. And it was very open-ended, but I will be doing it pretty soon with my students, so I'm excited to see what they come up with.
Is this the game right here, or where does it show up?
Oh no, it was at the very end. I think it was like day 10 or something.
Okay. There's a lot of detailed stuff in here you see in the classroom activities. Very well mapped out.
I think you passed it. Yeah, so the project was planetary probability. Yeah, I also, unfortunately, Algebra 1 is a keystone subject. So I did include a day for covering like standardized test questions that students would see on the keystone or the SAT.
There's nothing wrong with that, right? You
Yeah.
can, you have
As long
to
as it's still a
prepare
reality.
for those things, you might as well include them. All right. Other questions about this unit or in general? Pam?
There's a really good point about including the standardized test stuff.
Hold on, I
I'm
think.
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, mine's not about their presentation, mine is about the template they just sent us.
Yeah.
Is that a working template, you download it and you can actually write on it, or is that just a flat attachment?
It's just a Microsoft Word document template with headings, fonts, and margins all set for you. So all you need to do is, put your text into that template. Other than that, it doesn't provide you with anything in particular, in terms of content. Does that make sense? Yes. Wait, Rachel, you had a question first.
Oh, I just had a comment that idea of nodding to the things that we are required to do feels like we don't want to do it, but in the long run, it makes it more sustainable and usable for teachers. Like if it's really going after a Common Core standard or does something that the school district asks us to do, it feels more sustainable because it's going to have a higher probability of being used and justified within a school district or for a principal or for an administrator.
Right.
Yeah.
Speaking of probability, right?
Right.
And like one way I sort of got around that was, or one way that in this like kind of experiment last year with my students experimenting with this topic was I would like pose a question that was kind of framed as like a standardized test question and write an answer. And I would ask students to explain that why the answer made sense and why it was correct, or say that is incorrect. I know that it's incorrect because of this, and this would be the correct answer because of this reason. And I felt a little less like forced and mechanical.
Yeah, you had a question as well.
Yeah, it's just so impressive how all of these can be applied, even outside of your classrooms. Like I'm thinking about yours. Everybody in the district, a lot of schools in the district share that problem with this suspension of in-house and restorative practices is the new buzzword. So there's so much richness about these curriculums. I think it just promote it with our principals and maybe even tips, just really get it out there amongst principals, how this stuff has practical, just like research that takes place in a lab, you take it out in the real world, and it really does. So all of you, wonderful. It's just amazing. It's so intracurricular. You can almost collaborate with another teacher, music teacher, say, hey, can you help? Let's work together to teach this part of the unit, and you can really get more out of it, all of it.
I think that's the hardest part too, is that we all want to achieve so much, and we really do, like Amanda was saying earlier, we really do have this kind of short time frame. So you want to do all of these things and make this a cross-curricular unit and incorporate English and music and art and everything, and as best as you can, you're trying to explain that, I think, in your unit. Even if you're not including it in the lesson plans exactly and laying it out like day 1 through day 180, you have that thought process in there somewhere that this does aim to achieve all of these things, and this is a topic that can be applied in all these different content areas.
Absolutely. Okay, so I hope this was all helpful for you, and as you can see, the format of the curriculum units has changed a little bit. We're standardizing a little bit more what goes into rationale, what goes in the background, but I would say that in terms of what goes into a unit overall, it's really the same thing, the same basic elements are there. And so I encourage you to take a look at these units in particular, and many of the other units that are up there as a model for your own writing of curriculum units.
Thank you.
Thank you.